Hey everyone, welcome back to POL 935, Computational Social Science. This week I just have a short video for you where we talk about one topic that is really important and that we kind of touched upon in almost every week this semester. Specifically, we're going to talk about ethics and ethical research. So before we get into the topic, let me just briefly talk about the to-do list for this week. So before our Q&A session, if you haven't done so already, please read the last two chapters in the Bit by Bit books. That's chapter 6 on ethics and chapter 7 as kind of the conclusion. Then also read the Gerber, Green, and Larimer 2008 piece on social pressure and voter turnout. I don't have any slides on that paper this week, but we will talk about it a little bit in our Q&A session, and most importantly, the assignment will discuss that paper in more detail. So you'll have to read that paper for the assignment as well. And then, as I mentioned, finish assignment 4 posted on Canvas on RStudio Cloud. The submission or due date for the submission via Canvas is November 15th, so it's moved back a little bit. And I already posted the last 5th assignment as well, so you have that on Canvas already as well, and you can start working on that as soon as you're done with assignment 4. Lastly, for that assignment, you can review. You have to review the Van der Wind and Humphreys paper on crowd seeding in Eastern Congo, actually the Gerber Green paper will be discussed in assignment 5, and assignment 4 will be discussed in the assignment 4 will discuss the Van der Wind and Humphreys paper. So both of those are relevant for each assignment. And we'll talk about them in the Q&A session as well. All right, so let's get back into ethics. And as I said, this is something that we kind of repeatedly brought up when we talked about surveys and experiments and data collection online. Since throughout most of this course, we kind of talked about how the digital age kind of creates new opportunities for collecting and analyzing new types of data, social data, online web tracing data, and all different kinds of opportunities that are opened up, right? But what is important to keep in mind is that these opportunities not only, or these new data sources not only create opportunities for us as researchers, but they also create new ethical challenges, which makes it all the more important to think carefully about ethical implications in research projects, right? So given all these new opportunities for collecting and analyzing social data, while in the past there were a lot of limitations on what we could do, and what kind of data we could analyze. Now the limitations are not necessarily what is available or what kind of data is available, but whether we should make use of it or how we should make use of it in an ethical way, right? So as we're moving forward, as we talked about all these new kind of developments and exciting developments, we also have to recognize that research ethics will become increasingly central and will become harder and harder to avoid with these new data sources, right? But what is also important is that as we think about ethics and ethical research, it kind of goes in both directions, right? So on the one hand, we have to always be mindful and want to avoid violating people's privacy, or we want to, of course, avoid enrolling them into unethical experiments. But at the same time, we also want to prevent we don't want to prevent ethical and important research from happening, right? So the point here is not to say we need to restrict research more. There's certainly opportunities for important research to take place, and providing kind of clear ethical frameworks and guidelines also opens up new opportunities for research, right? So as we kind of talked about different papers and different kind of types of data sources, I want you to kind of reflect on the different topics that we talked about in the past, and certainly the chapter in the Bit by Bit book also kind of revisits some of the studies that we talked about, and kind of think about kind of the underlying ethical implications. And ultimately, as you go forward with your own research projects, you should ideally be able to kind of take these ethical considerations or ethical issues into consideration as you design your own research projects. And importantly, you should also be able to explain your decisions when it comes to kind of the ethical implications to others, and communicate those as well. So that's what that chapter focuses on, and that's what our readings and Q&A session this week will focus on. So how should we handle these new ethical challenges? And one important point here is that since we talk a lot about merging of social science and data science, it's important to realize that these two disciplines also come from different directions when it comes to the ethical implications, and also kind of the ethical frameworks that they're used to and working with, right? And so the way this is described in the Bit by Bit book is this distinction or juxtaposition between the rules-based approach, which is kind of the way social sciences is used to dealing with these ethical questions, through IRB, through clear guidelines for how research can be conducted and how it shouldn't be conducted, versus in data science, oftentimes when it comes to research that is happening in the industry, at Facebook or Airbnb or other companies, there's oftentimes less of a rules-based approach to these ethical questions, but rather a more ad hoc decision making, based on some ad hoc judgment whether certain practices are ethical or certain designs are ethical, right? And so what Selganik in the Bit by Bit book, what Selganik argues is that we kind of have to, as social scientists, we have to move beyond kind of the simple or rigid rule-based approach, because ultimately for many applications, in kind of that use kind of new data sources, kind of a too rigid rules-based approach is often not flexible enough, right? So the main argument is that researchers should, of course, evaluate the research, of course, based on the existing rules. They have to follow, IRB guidelines, but they also have to think more broadly about their research designs from the perspective of the underlying general ethical principles, right? And so this is kind of visualized in this in this flow chart, where we have the common rule as kind of the guiding the set of regulations that governs most federally funded research in the United States, which is which is kind of a rule-based approach, but of course that in of itself is not sufficient. You have to kind of think about the underlying principles that these rules are based upon, and evaluate those based on ethical frameworks in order to have a broader understanding of the ethical implications and issues that are related to whatever research you're working on, right? And in the chapter, there are a couple of examples that we talked about before. For example, this emotional contagion experiment, which I also the paper uploaded or linked again. I linked again on Canvas, and we'll talk about that also for the fifth assignment, actually, because we'll a small part of the assignment will kind of discuss that paper again a little bit in the context of power analysis. So we'll get back to that as well, right? Yeah. So overall, data science or people from a data science background usually look or used to look at these ethical implications or ethical issues kind of using a more ad hoc approach. Social scientists are used to a more kind of rules-based approach. What does the IRB want? And essentially what we need is a more principle-based approach that kind of course, takes the rules for granted, but kind of takes a broader perspective on the underlying principles and ethical frameworks that guide those common rules, right? So when we talk about these 4 principles for ethical research that guide the common rules, the 4 principles that are outlined in the chapter are mostly from the Belmont report and the Menlo report, which are which are basically reports that were created by blue ribbon panels to provide ethical guidance for researchers, right? And I'll just go through them, one by one. The first 3 are from the Belmont report. The first one of which kind of emphasizes the importance of respect for persons. And the underlying idea is basically that it's the participants who decide whether to be in the research and how to kind of be involved in the research, and not the researcher, right? So this is ultimately this principle ultimately means that individuals should be treated as autonomous, and they should have, as being autonomous, they should have the last decision whether they want to be involved in research or not, right? So this is kind of the principle where informed consent, or the requirement for informed consent, is ultimately grounded upon, right? And of course that also means that individuals with, for whatever reasons, diminished autonomy, for example, children or people who are in correctional facilities and so on, have to be entitled to additional protections, because their autonomy to decide whether to be in a study or not is diminished. Okay. The second core principle is beneficence, and what we mean by that is that in designing a research or in designing a research project, we have to think about in every step to minimize risks for participants and maximize the benefits. And then kind of based on the risk-benefit trade-off and the calculation or the risk-benefit analysis, then decide whether the research kind of the potential benefits outweigh the risks, right? And this can be a really complicated and really difficult question to answer, and it certainly has to be analyzed on a case-by-case basis. And one thing that is important here is that whenever you're kind of thinking about potential risks or potential benefits, is to potentially consult or ask for outside perspectives to look at the potential benefits and to what extent you indeed minimize the risks, and to what extent the benefits indeed outweigh those risks, right? One important aspect in this context is, for example, the importance of open and reproducible research, for example, through sharing data, because that obviously increases the benefits of the research, right? So if I collect survey data or other types of data and make that available to other researchers, ultimately that will increase the overall knowledge or overall will benefit research more. So we have a kind of a clear incentive to maximize those benefits, to share the data, for example, with others. But at the same time, that of course increases certain risks as well, and so we already see how there can be conflicts between those principles. Okay. The third principle is justice, and what we mean by that is an equal distribution of burdens and benefits of the research, right? And traditionally, especially when you think about medical research and some of those examples, for example, the Tuskegee syphilis study, which was kind of the starting point for the development of the Belmont report because of the horrific treatment of the participant or subjects in that study. Traditionally, the focus was on the kind of an equal distribution of potential burdens in research projects, because if research projects involve certain risks, you want to kind of distribute them equally, or not have one specific group in the population be more subject to those risks. But it's also important or it's becoming increasingly, part of the focus to also think about the benefits of the research, right? So who ultimately will benefit most from the research results and things like that, and that should be distributed equally across groups as well. And lastly, and this is kind of an addition to the principles that are outlined in the Belmont report, is the respect for law and public interest. And what we mean here is kind of there are two important components here. One is compliance, for example, with local laws, or when we talk about kind of online data collection, oftentimes terms of service agreements. So that's one component, compliance, and the other component is transparency-based accountability. But what we mean by transparency-based accountability is that researchers, that there is an additional accountability mechanism by virtue of publishing and making public the research design, with publishing the findings and describing the design and describing whatever experiments you're running. There is an accountability mechanism because other researchers review that work. The results are ultimately published in a journal, and then to the extent that there were ethical issues, then of course they will also be subject to scrutiny kind of after the fact, right? So that's one important aspect. But when it comes to compliance, especially larger multinational research, or especially research data collection online, it's oftentimes very difficult to comply with every local law across. There were examples in the book about laws, either in the U.S. statewide laws, or if you have data collection, for example, the study on censorship online, where you in principle would have to kind of comply with every national law depending on where the subject is resident, the participant is resident. Of course, that can be extremely difficult or unrealistic. Okay. But the important is here that this idea of respect of law and public interest is kind of related to this principle of beneficence, but beneficence tends to focus on participants, specifically on participants, right? Whereas the respect for law and public interest kind of explicitly encourages researchers to take a wider view and to include considerations of other stakeholders, for example, and directly takes into account compliance with laws and local rules and all that stuff, right? So just to give you one more example, since I brought up terms of service agreements, and I uploaded this paper on Canvas as well, if you would like to take a look. This paper is not part of the required readings, but feel free to check it out if this is interesting to you. I think some of you might be interested in this, which is MapWatch Detecting and Monitoring International Border Personalization on Online Maps. So this is a really interesting short paper which examines how private corporations that provide online map services deal with international border disputes, and one thing that these these corporations do is that they ultimately kind of avoid these disputes by showing users, depending on their location, different versions of the same map if there is a disputed border, right? And so what these researchers did is essentially they created a system which I call MapWatch, which detects and identifies kind of personalization of international borders in online maps, right? And so ultimately, what this system does is it crawls maps from Google and Bing, and basically kind of with different location IPs, and then uses crowd workers to identify border personalization. So here's, for example, one kind of recent example. This is in the paper of the border changes separating the Crimean Peninsula from Ukraine on Google Maps, and you can see. It's a little bit hard to see, but if you check it out in the paper, it'll be a little bit easier to make out. But essentially, if you kind of view this map with a Russian IP, you'll see a clear border separating Crimea from Ukraine. If you view this from the Ukraine, you of course see the opposite, no separation between Crimea and Ukraine. And if you see this internationally, all countries except Russia and Ukraine, you see a little kind of contested border marker. Okay, so this is one of these examples of showing kind of personalized maps depending on the location of the user. Right. The point here is not really this specific example. The point here is that this study itself kind of on its face violates the terms of service agreements of these map providers, right? And so there's a little paragraph on ethics where the authors write, many web app platforms discourage all automated crawling outside the API, which is exactly what they did. And even within the API, a platform may prohibit research in its online terms of service documents, usually for competitive reasons. We agree with the citation I didn't copy, that non-commercial research for the public good that deals with issues of societal importance must be able to access public web resources for research purposes as long as automated processes do not produce an unreasonable load. This was our guiding philosophy in this research design, right? So the important thing here is that the researchers kind of transparently kind of discussed the issue of ethics and the issue of, for in this case, terms of service violations to conduct this research. And of course, in the context of this research question, it doesn't involve kind of an unreasonable load on the servers of that service that is being provided. And ultimately, it's an important kind of scientific finding to kind of measure these disputed borders, right? So check this out as kind of an example where ethical research doesn't always have to, it always involves trade-offs, right? And so sometimes these trade-offs involve violating terms of services within reason. This is one of those examples that where if you go by the text of itself, this is kind of a violation of the textbook terms of service, but they lay out, and this is kind of an example of this transparency-based accountability. They lay out the process, they lay out the ethical considerations, and say this is kind of it doesn't produce an unreasonable load, and therefore say that as non-commercial research for the public good, this is acceptable, right? So this is an interesting example, right? So I laid out these 4 principles for ethical research: respect for persons, beneficence, justice, respect for law, and public interest. And of course, the question is how, and as I already mentioned, there are obviously conflicts between these principles for ethical research, right? So they often stand in direct conflict with each other, and so the important question then, of course, becomes how do we balance these principles? And this is where kind of these ethical frameworks then come into play. This is now going back to this flow chart, where we can evaluate these principles and these trade-offs both kind of from a consequentialist perspective, which focuses more kind of on the underlying ends or kind of focuses in from a moral or ethical perspective, focuses more on the underlying goals that we're trying to achieve, and evaluates the ethical kind of trade-offs from that perspective, versus a deontological perspective, which focuses more on the means, so focusing more on following ethical principles in the actual procedures, disregarding or potentially disregarding, the actual ends or outcomes, right? So one is more outcomes focused, one is more focused on the means through which that outcome should be achieved or can be achieved, right? And this is outlined more in this chapter. Ultimately, of course, what we need is some kind of blend of these ethical frameworks, right? And so a lot of these ethical disagreements, whether one research or whether one principle is more important than another, or how certain ethical trade-offs can be resolved, ultimately revolve around a more consequentialist perspective or a more deontological perspective, focusing more on the ends or focusing more on the means. To what extent can potentially unethical procedures be justified by the outcome, the social benefit of the outcome, versus a pure focus on the ethical procedures, disregarding what the ultimate outcome might be, right? So obviously we need a blend of these, and obviously these are not questions that have a direct immediate easy answer, but the important thing is that these principles and the underlying ethical frameworks help us kind of understand the trade-offs that are involved in the research projects, right? So it's important to kind of keep those in mind and think about those as you design your research. And while they don't provide you with a clear, definitive answer in every case, they at least help you think through the problems and think through the ethical implications, but also communicate those to other researchers, when it comes to ultimately accountability and kind of explaining to others what the ethical considerations were, right? So taking into account this framework, there are a couple of different areas of difficulty, but I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a brief break here, because I'm already at almost 30 minutes, and then finish it off in a short video where I talk about the areas of difficulty.